Kelly, I haven't seen you for a while. Russ has come back to doing the presentation this week. He did a really great one last time, but he's going to be talking to us about the clocks of Abner Jones. So everybody welcome him aboard. Do a presentation for us today.
Thanks for inviting me again. Probably you're not surprised that I'm talking about another New York State maker. I really think that Abner Jones is if nothing else, a very unusual and very special maker. Just to set the scene a little bit, we're talking about the period 1810 through about 1840. And of course, we all know that was a time of massive change and upheaval in the American clock industry. During that period, the handcraft artisan period of brass tall clock making ended. The woodworks era started, where the masses for the first time were able to afford clocks. Then we saw the start of the cheap brass shelf clock movement era with Joseph Ives around 1830. And then by the early 1840s, with spring-driven movements and the rise of the large corporations that put virtually all of the small makers, small producers around the country out of business. All of this happened in the period when our subject today, Abner Jones, was operating. And he had some unique aspects to his clockmaking, as we'll see. The other point I would make is that when we talk about clockmaking in America, before 1830 or so, there were lots of small producers. After that, the small producers went out. Abner Jones was one of the smallest of the small producers. From what we can tell, he made less than 100 clocks. And that's one aspect of his production that makes his clocks so exclusive. And then he had a number of unique features, which we will be reviewing. And let's see if I can make this work. Come on. All right. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we go. Without equal. I'm not claiming that he made the best clocks ever made. I'm just claiming that he made clocks pretty much like no one else did, certainly in this period. And as I note at the bottom there, one of the early researchers on Abner Jones that I rely on in terms of basic early research was a wonderful gentleman named Evan Edwards in Rochester, New York, and I want to give him credit for his early work. So we're talking about Abner Jones. He operated in Bloomfield, New York, which we'll talk about. As you know, for many, many years, many decades, most people paid attention to the Connecticut clock industry, as deservedly so. In the last 30 years or so, a number of us have spent some time in upstate New York, looking at the makers there and pointing out some of the interesting and exceptional craftsmen who work there. And certainly Abner Jones, with his what certainly could be called huge, flamboyant, and unique clocks, is worthy of research and has emerged as one of the most intriguing of the upstate makers. Beyond his clocks, as with most of these makers, when you first start out, not much is known about them. So my study involved where did he come from? When did he make his clocks? That was a matter of conjecture for a long time. Where did he make his clocks? What were his production totals? And as I mentioned earlier, that's an important fact because it's always been rumored that he made less than 100 clocks, which depending upon your position might be hard to believe or certainly credible. And again, the intent was to answer as many of those questions as we could. We haven't answered them all, but hopefully we've covered a few. So we'll start at his homestead in New Hampshire. He was born in 1789 in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. His father was Jacob and his mother was Hannah Jones. His father, Jacob Jones, was a clockmaker. He came from Seabrook, New Hampshire, moved to Pittsfield in the late 1700s with a group of fellow Quakers. And Jacob Jones was a brass tall clockmaker, well known. His clocks are known. He signed his dials. Jacob trained under Daniel Bouch of Bradford and Newburyport, Massachusetts. The maps on the right show the state of New Hampshire with Merrimack County outlined, and then the lower map shows where the town of Pittsfield is in Merrimack County. This is the homestead of Jacob Jones and where Abner grew up. The picture on the left actually came from a book published around 1950, so it's a photo taken in the 20th century of a pretty decrepit looking house, but somehow that house survived. And on the right is what the house looks like today. And it took me a little while to figure out what was going on here. But you'll notice the chimney on the left on the original photo is missing, but the other chimney's there. The lower windows around the portico have been turned into lovely bay windows. And then a large section of the house has been added onto the right-hand side. And you can see in the more recent photo that the section on the left, the little wing off to the left, has been torn off there sometime within the last 10 or 15 years. And that's likely where the clock making shop of Jacob Jones actually originally was. So one of the interesting facts about Abner Jones is that pretty much forever he's been confused with another Abner Jones. And the reason it was so confusing is that they were relatives and they lived within 30 miles of each other. And they were both clockmakers at the same time within about 30 miles of each other. So here we have a family tree, starts with John Jones at the top. He had two sons, John and Abner. Our Abner is descended from the John Jones part. You'll see Jacob Jones down below John on the left here. And below him, Jacob Jones had 4 sons, one of which was our Abner. If you follow the line up above to the son of John, Abner, he had a son, Joseph, and that Joseph had a son, Abner, so they were third cousins. And pay attention to the lower left over here. There's a Richard Jones, who was a nephew of Abner, and we'll talk about him a little bit. But you can see how close the two Abners were in age, only about 3 years difference, and again, about 30 miles difference. And because they were both clockmakers, historians have mixed them up pretty much forever. Some of the histories have our Abner Jones' birth date, but the other guy's death date, and vice versa. And this was a factor that I think affected Abner Jones and maybe why he moved to New York. So clearing up the confusion. As noted, our two Abners got confused, our guy and his third cousin, of Ware, New Hampshire, which is where the second guy was. One difference was the Abner Jones in Ware, New Hampshire actually put his name on his clock dials. And you can see on the far right, a dial from Abner Jones, Ware, New Hampshire. That's the third cousin. But if you take the bonnets off the clock and check behind the dials, you can tell the difference between the clockmakers. On the far left, you have an example of an Abner Jones Ware, New Hampshire brass tall clock movement. And then in the middle, you have a movement by Jacob Jones, Pittsfield, Abner's father. And then on the far right, you have a movement by our Abner Jones, and you can see the absolute similarities between the two Jones, Jacob and Abner, our Abner clocks, and the differences between them and the Abner Jones Ware. So again, if you take the tops off and the dials off, which not many people do, you can tell the difference. One thing to notice on these, on the two Jones clocks, is that all of the rack and all of the lifting pieces for the strike operations are made of brass, not steel. And that's very unusual, and that's absolutely characteristic of both the father, Jacob, and Abner Jones, the son, in all of their movements. So that's one way to tell the difference. So Abner Jones went to New York. Records indicate that when he was 29 years of age, he relocated from New Hampshire to really what was a frontier in Western New York in 1818. And it appears that he was accompanied by his nephew, Richard, remember, the son of one of Abner's brothers. Abner was 29. His nephew, Richard, was 22. So they were really more like brothers in terms of age than uncle and nephew. Their arrival was announced by an advertisement in the local newspaper in Canandaigua, New York. And the ad stated, "Brass Foundry. The subscribers have established a brass foundry in the brick building near the meeting house in East Bloomfield, where they will manufacture shovels and tongs, andirons, fenders, clockwork, sleigh bells, and other brass castings. They also make or repair clocks and watches in a faithful manner. They purchase old copper, brass, pewter, and block tin at fair price. Page and Jones, Bloomfield, July 18th, 1818. And you might be saying, who is Page? And the unfortunate thing is we have no idea who Mr. Page was. Believe me, I've checked all the deed records, census records, etc. There's no plausible Mr. Page anywhere around. He may have been someone who came with them from New Hampshire and bailed out at some point. If he was there, he wasn't there very long, and his name doesn't appear anywhere else in the record. So again, I said early on, we didn't answer all the questions, and that's one of what we didn't answer. Why did they end up in Western New York? Again, we can't answer all the questions. The map on the lower right shows the outline of New York State and where Ontario County is. So it's definitely in Western New York. And then the main map shows Ontario County, and in the square there is what was the town of Bloomfield before 1833, when the people in the west part of the town decided they wanted to set up their own little town government. So it became West Bloomfield in 1833. But when Abner arrived, that was all one township. All right, so this is the little, these folks from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, when they settled in Western and Central New York, they set up little New England villages. So they each had their village green and the church on the green, et cetera, et cetera. And Bloomfield was no different. Here's a map from about 1850 or so, but this is what it looked like early on with Village Green. You've got the Congregational Church here in the center. Next to that, on this map, it says Academy. That's originally where the meeting house for the Congregational Church was located. And as our ad said, the foundry was next to the meeting house on the Village Green, and that puts the probable location of the foundry right here, the brick building foundry, circa 1818, when they moved to Bloomfield. So I looked around trying to ascertain where they lived in the village, and it turns out that their early residence was actually rented or leased, so they didn't have any property deeds. But we were able to find them in the 1820 census. And for some reason, as you can see on the census list here, they listed the primary resident as Richard Jones, not Abner, but in the commentary, the numbers and so forth, clearly the Richard and Abner were living together in the village of Bloomfield. The original house they rented was sold in 1824, and they moved south of the village, which we'll look at in a minute. The other major event in 1820 was that they both got married. Richard was married in April of 1820, and Abner was married in October of 1820, both in the Congregational Church. And they married sisters, Lucy and Sabra Hickox, respectively, who were daughters of a farmer in Bloomfield. So as I said, their rental house was sold in 1824, and then they moved to a house south of the village. So here's the village of Bloomfield. This is the village green up here where the arrows are, and this direct road south to this corner where they started renting this house in 1824. And this is what the house looks like today. I suspect the original house is under there somewhere, but the owner couldn't verify that. So that's what it looks like today. Their first clocks were tall clocks, not surprisingly, and I've located 4 clocks so far. Certainly there are others. This clock is a very interesting case in beautiful original condition. This is in the local historical society. It's cherry with bird's eye and tiger maple trim. Always in a family in Bloomfield until it was donated to the museum in the 1980s. Here's an original dial from a Boston maker, Nolan and Curtis. Here's the typical Abner Jones tall clock movement and weights and hands from this clock. I tried to get the Historical Society to get this clock out of the attic and put the parts back together, but unfortunately they didn't take my advice or haven't taken it yet. Clock number 2 came out of Connecticut. The owners didn't really know how that their grandfather came by it, but it went from New York East at some point in its life. A very tall, 92-inch tall case. Again, basic cherry with mahogany, crotch cherry in the door, tiger maple features throughout, and a very delicate arch in the top. And again, the dial on this one probably came from Boston as well. One distinguishing feature on this clock is that it actually has an inscription on the inside that says, made by Abner Jones, case made by Daniel Miles, December 1820. And it also says the cost was $85, which in current money would be more like $4,000 to $5,000, which, if true, certainly made it an exclusive item. I have checked the Daniel Miles reference. He was a shop owner in Bloomfield. There's nothing else to suggest that he was a case maker other than this notation. So he may well have been, or somebody might have added that at some point to embellish his resume. Our third clock here sold at auction in upstate New York in 2009. On the seat board, it says made by Abner Jones. The hands on this clock look just like the hands on clock number 2 and clock number 1. And you can see those hands on the lower right-hand dial down here. So that is a distinctive feature of the Abner Jones clocks. This has a solid cherry case. Again, a very nice, delicate arched top. And you can see the movement on the upper right. And our last dog clock has a wonderful cherry case with mahogany veneer and tiger maple. Again, really similar to the prior 2 cases, so might be a common case maker. This has a Philadelphia dial. You can see the movement here and a close-up of the bonnet and the dial here. So by the time Abner and Richard Jones left Pittsfield, as we noted really early, American clockmaking and marketing had fundamentally changed. The age of the handmade artisan movement tall clock trade was really turned upside down by Eli Terry when he developed his mass production and interchangeable parts to produce wood movement tall clocks in 1806 through 1809. And that really bowed the end to the handmade artisan movement. You could buy probably 10 woodworks clocks for the price of an 8-day brass movement clock. So when Richard and Abner moved in 1818 to 1820 to upstate, really that life was already ended. And you could say they got a bit of a reprieve in upstate New York because things quite hadn't developed there yet in terms of trade and transportation. So they could make tall brass movement clocks for a few more years before time caught up to them. But the age really was closed in 1825 when the Erie Canal was completed through upstate New York, opening up markets from Connecticut really into the Midwest. And it meant that any clock producer in Connecticut could have his goods in the hands of upstate New York in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks. And the artisan age was really over. So they got a few-year reprieve before the tall clock era ended in upstate New York. Brass movement tall clock era ended also. And clearly it had ended by 1825, 1827, when Richard and his family moved from Bloomfield about 25 miles southwest. And Richard started a foundry there. So tall clock production was ended probably about 1825, 26 or so by Abner Jones. And Abner and his family were, again, back to the foundry operation and a bit of farming. And Richard passed away in 1846, by the way. The property that we talked about south of Bloomfield there, that they had moved to in 1824, they actually bought that property formally in 1832. It was a total of 128 acres and 3 parcels, so they were also involved in farming. And sometime around 1830, 31, Abner Jones got an idea that he couldn't make tall clocks anymore, so he was going to try his hand at shelf clocks. And if you were going to produce shelf clocks in that period, just like the Connecticut guys, they adapted the style of the cases of their clocks to the furniture preferences at the time. That meant empire style furniture, which followed the Greek Revival architectural style. And here we have a picture of a typical upstate New York house in this period, showing the Greek Revival columns and pediments. And these styling cues were also followed in empire furniture. And if you wanted to sell a clock to people who liked empire furniture, then you fashioned your clocks on that style. And we'll see how we did that in a second. So what did he use for movements? Unlike pretty much any other maker that I can think of, rather than totally redoing his tall clock movements to adapt them to shelf clocks, he pretty much stayed with the same movements and just varied some of the gear counts in his movements. So we have a tall clock movement here on the left and a shelf clock movement on the right. And I think we'd all be hard pressed to tell any significant difference between the two, because there really wasn't any significant difference other than some of the gear changes to utilize pendulum lengths that were shorter. And with compounded weights, the clocks would run 8 days. Other characteristics of these unusual movements. Abner Jones did not sign his shelf clock dials or cases. Don't know why, he just never did, which wasn't very helpful for researchers or owners. But some of the movements are numbered, but not all of the movements, which again is a head scratcher and a bit frustrating. And a few of the movements might have both numbers and dates, or maybe there's just a date on the movement, And that's just a handful of these movements have dates on them, but nonetheless, the ones that do have dates are at least somewhat helpful. If you're going to find a movement number on one of these movements, they're typically above the great wheel on the front of the back plate, right in here. And in the lower right, you see a picture of a number in that location. And then, as I said, a few of these movements are dated, and the earliest clock or the earliest date on any of the shelf clocks that we have is this one shown right in the middle, lower, which is 1831. So apparently that was the year he started making his shelf clocks, 1831. And the other thing that's distinctive about Abner Jones is he made the largest shelf clocks, as far as I can tell, made in this era in the United States. His small clocks were over 3 feet high, and his larger clocks were over 5 feet high. And these were shelf clocks, remember. So you can see from the left to the right, and on the far right is the largest clock that he made. And I put these into groupings, which we will be briefly going over. And just for fun, I added in the middle here a little graphic showing the average height of a man in the United States in 1830, which was barely taller than Abner Jones' tallest shelf clock. Characteristics of his cases. Abner Jones is famous for the drawers in the bottom of his clocks. Actually, the majority of the clocks that have survived don't have drawers, but about half of them do. So he's still famous for that. This has 4 drawers. Most of them have 3, and a few of them only have 1 drawer. And of course, the other major feature, which is typical of Jones and a number of other clockmakers, of course, was that they added what they call looking glasses or mirrors to their clocks. The mirrors actually were, as you probably heard, more expensive than reverse patent tablets, but they were an amenity added to the clock to attract buyers. So you got a clock, in this case, you got a clock, a chest of drawers, and a looking glass, which is a pretty good deal for one price. Now, the other thing that Abner Jones is known for is he had a unique dial treatment. Why he just didn't have a regular dial like everybody else, who knows, but this is a distinctive feature of his clocks. He had 2-piece dials. The upper right here, you can see the back of the dial portion that has the chapter rings and the spandrels is a zinc, cast zinc in most cases, plate painted on the front that's attached to the back of the door. And it's got a big round opening, and the big round opening is filled by this blank dial that is attached to the movement. And this will contain obviously the hands, and in some cases a seconds bit, but other than that, it's just a plain white dial. Now, this design caused a bit of a problem in terms of the hands, because typically the minute hand is longer than the hour hand. And if the minute hand were longer than 5 inches, which is the diameter of this centered part, every time you open the door, you would break the minute hand. So that was a bad idea. So Abner Jones shelf clock hands are both the same length, but he differentiated by opening the heart shape on his hour hand and a little spade end on the minute hand. So it's easy to tell them apart, and it's really not that noticeable. But again, this is an absolutely unique dial treatment. Why he did it, I'm not sure, but it adds to the amenities that Abner offered. His dials are wonderful, sort of folk arty. I'm not sure who painted them. There are a couple possibilities, but they are one of the features of these clocks. They're on zinc dial plates. One of the problems with the zinc dial plate was, I don't know what primer they used, but in most cases, it wasn't great. On this middle dial, you can see some delamination starting and some repairs. This one's been repaired a little bit. And here's, unfortunately, a fairly typical situation in the upper right, showing how this wonderful, beautiful dial is delaminating because the paint didn't like sticking to the zinc dial plate. So that's a unfortunate factor. When did shelf clock making begin? As noted before, it looks like it started 1830, 1831. I've grouped these early clocks into what I call, remarkably enough, group one. This is a picture of the clock that has the earliest known date on any Abner Jones clock, 1831. And the other unusual feature of this clock is it's the only timepiece known to have been produced or survived made by Abner Jones. All of the other clocks are time and strike. What he was doing, whether he was attempting to make both types of movements, we're not sure. In any case, he quickly, if he was making more than one timepiece, he stopped quickly thereafter because this is the only one that survived. And the other confusing factor in terms of a researcher is we talked about how the rumor was he only made fewer than 100 clocks, which may or may not be true. But this movement actually has a number on it. And of course, just to confuse the researchers, the number on this movement is 150. I presented this to the great researcher Snowden Taylor some years back, and Snowden said, "Oh, there's a simple answer to that." He said he was starting a separate number sequence for the timepieces from the shelf clock, the time and strike. So he started the timepieces at 150. And I said, well, that makes sense to me. So I'll stop asking the question. Here's the timepiece movement. It does have time side gears, just like the ones in the tall clock in the other shelf clock movements. The middle photo shows where the 1831 shows up on that plate, and here's a close-up in the upper middle. And then on the back plate is found the number 150. So we tried to hide it back there, but nonetheless, there it is. To follow up on the timepiece, here's the beautiful original dial. Most of the dials in the group one clocks turned out very well compared to the other dials, and this certainly is a fantastic example. This clock was in the same family until 2017, I think it was. Original purchase right in Bloomfield. It was actually in the American Clock and Watch Museum on loan for a number of years before it was sold by the family. When I first saw this clock, it had these goofy looking hands on it, which were unlike any other of the Abner Jones shelf clock hands that I'd seen. And I, talking to Tom Manning at the time at the museum, I said, "Oh, those hands clearly are wrong." And Tom actually took the hands off and put some brass hands on that everybody knew Abner Jones used. And then a few years later, I was looking at the tall clock hands in the Ontario County Museum that we looked at earlier, and my brain clicked in and I said, holy moly, those are the same hands. So this is the timepiece that has the earliest date known on it, and what it has for hands are cut off tall clock hands where they snipped off here below the little heart and then just cut the minute hand off. So that's another reason to maybe believe that this was the earliest shelf clock sold by Abner Jones, is that it's got tall clock hands for hands, and this is the only clock that has those. Okay, this case on the far left is virtually an exact duplicate of the case we just looked at that had the timepiece in it. It has the same dial. These are the only two clocks with that exact dial treatment with the open Arabic numerals, etc. But this one has gilt columns, not the painted black columns, and it has a time and strike movement. It also has these really nice revised hands. This is the only clock with these hands on them. I sort of like these hands. Don't know why he didn't keep moving them. There's a little bit more story to this clock, which we'll talk about later, but it clearly appears to be one of the earliest cases made by Abner Jones for his shelf clock movements. Now, the other group one clocks, this clock actually has a movement that's numbered number 2. The case is very, very similar. They've changed the column treatment, and it's not gilt or painted. It's got the 3 drawers just like the rest. It's got a revised dial, and these dials continue, but it's got the number 2 movement. This clock has number 3 movement. It's got the same dial as number 2, etc. There are a few other clocks that are numbered. This one is actually in the National Museum in Columbia. It's dated 1832 and has the number 6. So there's a total of 10 Group 1 clocks that we found to date, which is pretty good. Half of them have numbers on them, and the rest of them are shown here. This case just similar to the one we just saw, only with gilt columns. A few others, the dial's been changed on that one. Probably it went bad. The dial's been changed on this one. It probably went bad. The dial changed on that one. It probably went bad. And then the only one that only has 1 drawer is on the upper right there. But that is the total of the Group 1 clocks that we know of to date. The next group of clocks are very, very similar to Group 1. You may have noticed, maybe you didn't, because I didn't point it out, but on a number of these clocks, there's this little box thing up at the top of the case. You look in the middle there, you see that little box on the top? It's sort of aesthetically displeasing. And why is it there? Well, early on, after the first few clocks, he moved the bell, which had originally been screwed into the top plate, so it opened up below, to screwing into the back plate, and there wasn't enough room between the top of the movement and the top of the clock to fit the bell. Okay. So the bell, he gouged out the top plate of the clock, and the bell stuck out the top of the clock. And why did he do that? All I can think of, and it's probably not true, was that these cases are 1 inch thick all the way around, and maybe the bell wasn't loud enough, and people wanted a louder bell, so we cut a hole in the top and put a larger bell in the case, and that resulted in this ugly little bulge. Now, these clocks were big enough if they were on the mantle that you probably couldn't see that. But it looks as though one of the reasons these cases were redesigned with this box top, this little 3-inch additional on the top, was to cover up the bell that otherwise would stick out above the top of the case. So these are a little thinner than Group 1s, a little bit taller, but the same concept, 3 drawers at the bottom. And the Group 2 cases are exactly the same, which is more typical of a normal maker. After a while, you standardize production to save on costs, and so on. Let's see. Yeah, we talked about the bell. We have 8 of these Group 2 clocks that we know of that have survived. Only one of them has a number. That's this case here. This one does have original stenciling, the case on the left. On it, the drawer pulls need to be changed, but other than that, it's pretty original. This is the only Group 2 known with Roman numerals on it, and that dial does appear to be original. And the drawer pulls on this clock are original, and you can see the nice sort of sandwich glass pulls on those clocks. It looks as though the first 2 group of clocks were made in the original homestead there in East Bloomfield. And that property was sold in May of 1835. It was the same year that the foundry building next to the meeting house down on the green was sold. That ushered in Abner Jones and family move about 5 miles west to West Bloomfield. They sold the property in East Bloomfield for about $4,400. And they bought property in West Bloomfield. And here's a map close-up of West Bloomfield, and East Bloomfield is right over here, so it's not that far away. And in the lower map there, you can see the turnpike going east and west, and just west of the four corners in the village of West Bloomfield is the property that Abner and family bought for a total of $2,000. It included a house and 28 acres. This is the house on the left that exists on the property, and the owner swears that that house was built before 1835. So underneath all of this is the original house that they bought. The other building on the property is this commercial structure, and there may actually be some older structure underneath that. Not sure, but that's what's on the property today. And so for fun, I got the original deed and turned the links and chains into feet and mapped them out on a program. And this is how it came out. And instead of 25 acres, I got 23.6, but that's pretty good, or 0.4, which was pretty good. But if you notice the property drawing with the underlying current property map, they really match all of many of the existing current property lines in this area, which I thought was sort of interesting. And it points out the fact that in many of these upstate communities, the height of their economic prosperity was around 1840, 1850, and not much has changed since. And that's probably true of West Bloomfield as well. So luckily, we have a couple clocks that actually have dates on them that say 1835, so we can see what's changing. One of the clocks is this huge 50-inch plus giant empire case that's shown here in the middle. And it shows that they were absolutely, once they moved to West Bloomfield, they started changing the case designs. Obviously, they were competing with other clockmakers, both from upstate New York and Connecticut. And so they were attempting to broaden their output. Although this clock still retains drawers on the bottom, it does have this huge empire case up above. Always owned by the same family in East Bloomfield. And the family lore is that the reason the feet were taken off the clock, which they were originally big paw feet, at the base of the case was that this clock had been built into the wall in one of the family homesteads at one point, and that's how they lost the feet. So this clock on the movement actually has a number of notations. One is 1835. You can see here in the middle. It says 1835. And then there's a guy's name, G.W. Berry, is stamped below. And I did follow up on that. And G.W. Berry actually was from, guess where? Pittsfield, New Hampshire. And apparently he was a mechanic that came to work with Abner. He ended up buying homestead land from the U.S. government in Michigan. And after 1840, he and his family moved from Bloomfield out to Michigan. So we have a record of one of Abner Jones' mechanics, G.W. Berry, who decided to put his name on one of the movements he made. And here's an exploded view of an Abner Jones shelf clock movement with all its parts and pieces. Pretty elaborate layout of parts. Another clock, the other clock that has 1835 on the movement, is this totally different design. And this is just a beautiful scroll top, carved scroll top and column case. Unlike basically any other Abner Jones clock that we found so far, this one never had a middle dial and apparently was designed to openly show the beautiful brass movement inside. Of all of the Abner Jones clock cases that we're going to see, the most common surviving clock case by Abner Jones is this type of clock, the carved scroll top cases. Again, it's advertising the brass movement, and we have 14 of these clocks have been found so far, the most of any group. And of the 14 clocks, 4 of them are numbered. There's a 49, a 59, a 76, and a 77. And it points out the fact that after 1835, it doesn't look like the clocks were made in bunches, like they made this case and then they changed it to this case. The numbers show up in different cases, sort of ad hoc. So it almost looks like they were, if you walked into Abner Jones' shop and said, I saw one of these cases on my neighbor and I want one like that, he would make the cases to order. So there was no grouping of cases. It looks as though they were made throughout the period, almost on request. On the far left, you'll see the movement from that scroll top case. And there's another name on that clock, R.T. Reynolds, with the date 1835. And unlike Mr. Gilman, or Mr. Who was our last maker? Help me. Mr. Berry, thank you, Russ, for remembering a slide ago. Unlike Mr. Berry, I couldn't find anything on Mr. Reynolds, but we now have the name of 2 of the mechanics that worked for Abner Jones, Mr. Berry and Mr. Reynolds. Here are a few more of these group 4 clocks. You can see how they differed. The scroll tops are pretty much the same, but the columns would be full turn columns or full carved columns or turned and carved columns. The doors might be solid wood or mirrors. So they varied these, but otherwise the basic cases were the same. I grouped the next clocks that were very similar actually into 2 groups, 5 and 6, because the little cornice tops differed somewhat. One of the cornice styles were what I call a sloping form, and the other one were sharp cornices. And so having no other way to really differentiate between the 2, I called one group 5 and one group 6. Each of the groups had 3 sizes of clocks, small, medium, and large, which I'll go over at the second. We have 5 of the group 5 clocks that have survived, and one of them is numbered, number 48. And 9 of the group 6, the sharp cornice clocks, have survived. And 7 of them are numbered. And as I noted before, they're sort of all over the place: 50, 56, 64, 87, 90, 91, and 95. And we'll see some of the differences in the case sizes here. So the small clocks in these categories aren't really small. They're 36-inch tall. Again, just cornices, carved and turned columns, no drawers in these clocks. The medium-sized clocks were 40 inches, and then the large ones were 46 inches. And shown here is the only one of these groups that is actually numbered, and that's 48. Interestingly enough, 2 of these largest clocks in the sharp cornice cases are numbered consecutively, not on the movements, but on the pendulum bobs. We have a 90 and a 91. These are the only clocks known that have numbers on the pendulum bobs. And believe me, after we found these, we started looking at all the other pendulum bobs, but unfortunately, none of them had numbers on them. So how many clocks did he make? The rumor's always been that he made fewer than 100 clocks. As of basically today, I've located 63 surviving Abner Jones clocks, including 2 loose movements. Approximately 40% of those have either numbers or dates on them. The lowest stamped number is number 2, as we saw, and that's on a time and strike movement. The highest number on a time and strike is 96, and we'll look at that more closely in a minute. And then, of course, the highest number is 150, the big head scratcher with the timepiece movement. 1831 is the earliest date, and that also is on the timepiece movement. And as we noted, one of the clocks says 1832, and 2 clocks have been found with 1835. So is it possible that he only made 100 or fewer clocks? Well, we haven't, other than the timepiece, we haven't found any shelf clocks, time and strike shelf clocks with numbers above 100, so that opens up the possibility. But is it possible that over 60% of the clocks that he made have survived? And you'd have to say it might be unlikely, but it's possible because these clocks were so big, because they were so exclusive at the time, because so many of them became family heirlooms and had a local identity. So I point out it's hard to chuck a giant clock that weighs 30 pounds out into the garbage. It's a lot easier to grab a kitchen clock and say, oh, this old clock doesn't work anymore, let's throw it out. So maybe with all of those factors, the beauty of them, the size of them, the heritage, that people kept them more than they would some plain old OG or something. It's possible. We can't prove that he made more than 100 clocks yet. All right, the last 2 groups, the group 7 clocks are basically group 5 and 6 clocks with drawers. So he's back to putting drawers on these clocks. Apparently his customers, some of the customers said, hey, could you throw some drawers on that group 6 clock? We have one here on the left with only 1 drawer. The other examples, and there are only 4 of these that we know of so far, had 3 drawers on the bottom. But again, above the drawers are the group 6 cases. And the last grouping are the largest clocks that he made. And we think they're some of the last clocks because one of these has movement number 88 in it. And these clocks are over 55 inches tall. And how these work as shelf clocks still is a bit confounding in that if you put this on a mantle, you'd need about a 12-foot stepladder to wind them. Did they go on tables? And even so, to wind them would be almost 5.5, 6 feet, 6 feet or so more up. Anyway, we know of 4 of these, so they made a few, and there was some market for them, but they're just fascinating. Wonderful clocks. They have all the same dials, and they're very distinctive, different from any of the early dials, but the same basic 2-dial treatment on these. And we're going to raise up with a group of clocks, which I call group 3, because we started with this clock in 1835. But basically, we have 3 heavy empire cases that really don't fit into other category. One of the characteristics is that they have somewhat different dials. This big giant 53-inch plus clock has the smallest dial in terms of square inches of any of the dials, but one of the largest cases. When I did the book up, all I had was, I hadn't seen this clock, but I had pictures. And noted this unusual dial treatment. And then eventually I saw the clock, and lo and behold, on the back of this dial is the original dial. Look how that's totally delaminated. But it was an absolutely wonderful dial with unique features, some of which still appear in paint chips in the corners. But I guess if you've got an Abner Jones and the dial's shot, this is one way to keep the original, get this all sealed up just flip the dial plate around and have a reproduction dial painted on the other side, and you've got a beautiful clock and retain the original movement. And then we have this clock, clearly a late Abner Jones, beautiful big empire case. But for the first time, he adapted his case to a standard dial. Why he waited until he was basically going out of business to produce a clock with just a regular round dial that pinned to the movement, we don't know. But on this clock, the spandrels are painted, reverse painted on the dial glass, just like lots of makers did. Beautiful little floral treatment here, shown in the middle and then the lower right. But again, standard movement, beautiful, huge empire case, but he's changed his dial treatment finally. And then last but not least, the famous, at least to me, lost Abner clock. Keep that last case in mind. This clock was shown in a publication in the 1930s as part of a photo project called the Buell Bar Study. It was funded by Edward Ingram from the Ingram Clock Company. Basically, they went around to collections in Connecticut and New York, took pictures of clocks made in Connecticut. A book on the clock production in Bristol came out of this, and a photo album was supposed to come out of this, but it was never published. But there were 3 or 4 copies that were made that have floated around over the years. Here's what this the book says about this clock. It says basically 8-day brass movement and a tall clock movement in a shelf clock, which is true. Rack and stale strike, which is true. Verge between the plates like a tall clock movement. Crutch out the back plate, etc. Very, very accurate. And here's the picture of the clock. You remember that last case? Basically, it's just the bottom and the top are like the prior case we saw, but it's about 4 inches taller because the dial opening section is taller. And the reason it's taller is because it has this marvelous presentation of the movement inside basically a reverse painted, all the numerals, the chaptering are painted on the glass. And so you can see through it to this presentation of the movement and the bell. And you can see the hand painted, reverse painted sections of the tablet. And on the far right, you can see the little section I got from the last clock to show that the painting on this dial are exactly the same, on this tablet are exactly the same as that prior clock. Notice they had some painting on the upper part around the bell and around the center arbor as well. Just a fantastic clock. The problem is nobody's seen this clock since the 1930s. Hopefully it's still around. Believe me, I've looked and looked. I'd love to find it. If any of you own this clock, please let me know. But it's still missing. And one of the fascinating features of this clock that clearly was meant to be a presentation is I call an expression of horological serendipity. The front plate has flanking the center arbor and just above 3 exclamation marks cut into the front plate. You can see here this arrow, there's an exclamation mark there. There's one over here hidden under the rack arm. And then there's a third one sort of heading sideways here above the center arbor. And I just think that's clearly intentional and wonderful. You can see how the bell was attached to the front plate of the movement through this circular bracket. And again, all highly polished brass. And again, I would love to find out where this clock is today. Now, we mentioned early on, I was going to get back to this this case, which I said was identical case-wise to the timepiece case, and same dial and everything. So probably was one of the first shelf clock cases produced by Abner Jones, and I still feel that way. The interesting factor in this is that the movement in this case is not numbered number 1 or a low number. Of course, because Abner Jones likes to confuse me, this movement has the highest number of any known Abner Jones movement, 96. So what is the highest known movement number doing in one of what appears to be the earliest cases? If you can answer that for me, please call. One answer might be that it was Abner Jones' personal clock, that at some point the movement was bad, or at some point he decided to make a very special movement and put it in the case, which might be the answer, because the movement number 96 is unlike any of the other clock movements we found. You can see the picture on the lower right. The upper right, you can see the standard movement, beautifully made, beautifully done, etc. But when you look at the lower picture, there's all kinds of fantastic stuff going on. Notice the little shapes and turnings and all of these collets, like it's sort of like a fantasy land in here. Like, what is going on? And what is going on is a lot of embellishment in the collets on these gears, and all the time and effort it took to make these. I mean, this looks like a birthday cake. This looks like some sort of fountain. Obviously, somebody did extra work on this movement to embellish it purposefully. And the fact that it's in that early case with the latest movement makes one wonder whether it might have been Abner Jones' personal clock. So what happened to Abner? What happened to Abner was happened to most of the over 60% of the businesses in the United States. They became victims to what was called the Panic of 1837. Andrew Jackson, before he left office in 1836, refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, which was like the basic governing agency to control monetary policies in the United States, like the Federal Reserve today. And so when the Second Bank of the United States went under, basically there were dollars in New York City weren't worth the same amount as they were in Albany, New York, et cetera. There was no regulation. Banks failed throughout the country. Money became very scarce. Over 60% of the businesses in the country failed. If people owed you money, they weren't paying you. If you owed people money, you couldn't pay them. So it all steamrolled, and many businesses became bankrupt overnight. And that crisis lasted until the early 1840s. In late 1840, Charles Webb, the guy that Abner Jones had bought his property from, filed suit in the Court of Chancery, State of New York, Ontario County, for the overdue payment of his $1,700 mortgage. And Abner's property was sold in May 1841 at a public auction on the steps of the county courthouse at Canandaigua, New York. Webb bought his property back at $800. And then he quickly resold it later that month for $1,500 to a guy named Joseph Hall. And at the lower right, we have a map from about 1850, which shows Joseph Hall owning the property. And now the clock shop and foundry are a brewery, carriage factory, and a blacksmith shop. Abner Jones and family moved about 15 miles west to Avon, Livingston County, New York, where he continued as a brass founder. First, he rented property, then he bought this property on Prospect Street in the village. This is what it looks like today. There might be an old house under there. The 1860 census said he was a clockmaker. He lived with his sons and daughter, son Oliver, son William, daughter Elmira. Another son lived nearby and was a saddler. His wife, Sabra, died in 1842 after she gave birth to their fifth child. And Abner lasted through the 1870 census, where he was listed as a laborer rather than his previous listings as a brass founder or clockmaker, which may have been a reflection of a deteriorating health situation. In any case, he did live till the age of 86. He died on July 12th, 1876. His last days were a bit trying. A local researcher found in the records of the Livingston County Poorhouse the following reference: Abner Jones entered the Livingston County Almshouse on the 3rd of July, 1876. Suffering from insanity or dementia, he will not live over a month. He was a clockmaker. And then the newspaper on July 13th stated, during the latter days of his life, his mind became somewhat impaired, which increased upon him to such an extent that his friends were compelled to remove him to the asylum at Geneseo, where he died at 10 o'clock yesterday. And he was buried in the Avon Cemetery just down the street from his house. So what can we surmise from all of this? As noted, he was a representative of the last of the handmade, low production, tall and shelf clock maker era. He had many unique features of his clocks, and his clocks were, in my opinion, extraordinary. They were revered then as now as simply being without equal. And I thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you for that wonderful and informative presentation. Any questions?
Does he actually own any of the Abner Jones clocks?
Somebody asked if he actually, do you, Russ, actually have any of these clocks in your collection?
Okay, can you still see me?
No.
No.
It's going on screen.
Okay, wait a minute. Trying to. Am I showing up at all on your screen?
Yeah, but sign in with an iMessage and an Apple logo.
That's what I
Wait a minute.
It's me. I'm sure of it.
Oh, wait, it's us.
Anyway, so the answer is that I actually just donated a few clocks in the last year. I donated 82 clocks to the New York State Museum. I donated 4 clocks to National. I donated some clocks to Bristol. Anyway, to answer your question, I have owned or do own 6 Abner Jones clocks. So I owned 10%, 10% of the known Abner Jones clocks, which there. Now, can you see me? Okay. I apologize if you can see me now. Anyway, so and you know, I always aspired to own an Abner Jones clock, and I owned one for a long time, and then eventually you see a few more, and then you get a chance, and so yeah, no, I sort of surprised myself that I actually own 6. So I still have. Trying to remember. I think I still have 4. I donated one to National, one to New York State. So yeah, I still have 4 in the house, which is never enough. But anyway, one of the aspects. So I did publish a book. You may be aware of it. It's available on eBay, by the way, and National still should have a few. Published in 2022. So of course, when you do something like that, you hope that a lot of clocks will come out of the woodwork. And unfortunately, only 2 more clocks have emerged since then, but hopefully there are a few more out there. But they clearly weren't made in any big numbers, and you know, they're all wonderful, wonderful clocks. So yeah, the answer is I've owned a couple. I've owned a few, and actually 6. So. Other questions?
Did,
George.
do we have any idea who the case maker was or case makers?
Yes. Yes. So there was there was a tall clock or a case maker from a well-known Connecticut family. And of course, at the moment, I can't remember his name. Um, um, too many facts in my head. But they're right down the road from where Abner Jones' second home was in East Bloomfield there, where he started to make his shelf clock cases. Probably a half mile down the road was a guy who came from a well-known Connecticut family and made wonderful empire furniture. And so he's the most likely candidate, and why I can't remember his name at the moment, I apologize. But yes, so the shelf clocks, we have at least someone right in town there that clearly had the capabilities of making wonderful cases. With the tall clocks, that gentleman was there, so he may have made the tall clock cases too. But of course, we had that one that said that Daniel Miles made the case, so that confuses things. But yes, there is a possibility, but nothing in writing, no business records or anything that clearly indicates who made the cases. Clearly, Abner Jones didn't make his own cases, but you'd have to absolutely assume that in terms of the design of the cases, what he was looking for, that he dictated what the design would be.
Okay. Any other questions? One more, two more.
Do you think the bad design made it where you only produced so many clocks? They're just too tall to really, like you said, fit on a table or fit anywhere really.
Well, certainly when you look at these clocks and say, my goodness, how could anybody possibly fit those in the houses? So I think he was a throwback in a way of the tradition of basically, hand producing solid, heavy brass movement clocks. And that really never ended for him. So clearly his expectation was, by all appearances, never to be a high production maker, to always be an exclusive, what I guess you'd call today a boutique sort of maker. It doesn't appear he ever had any expectations of selling thousands of clocks a year, or either hundreds of clocks a year. It appears that he had an active group of buyers. He changed his clocks to attract buyers, etc. But he was never set up to make large numbers of clocks. So I wouldn't call that a failure. It more looks intentional. It's like if you're, if you're Ferrari, it's not your intention to make thousands of cars a year. Your intention is to make hundreds of cars and sell them at huge prices and say we have an exclusive product that nobody else produces. I put him more in that category, that his intention was to make, big, showy, the biggest, most flamboyant, heavy brass 8-day, top of the market clocks. I think that was his intention. That's what he intended to do, not to be a high production maker. And and you could also argue that if the Panic of 1837 hadn't wiped him out, style changes and costs probably would have before too long, because by 1840, 1845, not just 8-day, but 15 and 30-day brass movement clocks were being made with spring movements in any style you want. And that would have obsoleted Abner's giant, humongous clocks. In terms of the size, they fit into, other than those Group 8 giant clocks, which I still can't figure out. But the characteristics of the Greek Revival houses were 10 or 12 foot ceilings, 6 foot mantles, giant, showy, big, huge, solid construction. And these clocks fit that. These clocks fit that pattern.
Were the clocks weight driven or spring driven?
They're heavy weight driven, typically 13, 15 pounds on each side, compounded.
Would the size of the clock determine how big the weight was? Or how much weight he needed to make it move?
The compounding, okay, so he was fitting basically a tall clock movement into a shelf clock case. So he needed about 25, 27, 28 inches for the pendulum. And there simply wasn't enough straight weight drop in that size case to allow the clock to run 8 days. So we had to compound it. And of course, when you compound, you've got to double the weight. So that's how we made it all. That's basically how we made it all work.
I think, judging my interest, we really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.